All right. Can every, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So Janet and I have a long history with doing linguistics for the overall effort for Bible translation. I've been a part of Wycliffe Bible Translators for 40 years now. I started my training for linguistics and all that's involved right after I graduated from college. Janet took a different route. She was a research chemist with Kodak for a while, and eventually we met and got married, and then we worked in the meantime she had got an MA in applied linguistics, and we decided to, when we got married, to work in a place called Vanuatu, which is not too far from where Carol lives in Australia. It's between, it's an island nation between Fiji and Australia, has a population of about 250,000 people, and who speak over, there are over 100 languages spoken in Vanuatu, and then there are dialects, variations on top of that. So one of my jobs when we lived in Vanuatu was to explore undocumented languages and to compare them, to help draw language boundaries, language maps, see what other languages people spoke, that kind of thing. Do sociolinguistic research. Janet headed up some literacy efforts and helping people to write their unwritten language. And together we ran a translation training program for people from Vanuatu that wanted to translate the Bible into their own language. And these are two of the groups that we helped train. And the course was accredited by the government of Australia. And I'll let Janet tell more about that. We also have background in adult education, and Janet, like I said, has a background in helping people to read and develop written materials. So it's a bit ironic that our focus now is on coaching people to do Bible storytelling, where, especially for language groups that don't have a written Bible or a orally translated Bible to start from. So the idea is that if people would tell the stories in their own language, it would spark interest in wanting to do Bible translation in those languages. So we've been doing this since 2007, so 15 years now. We worked in Vanuatu for 15 years, and we've been with the Seed Company, which is part of Wycliffe, doing this, what we call oral Bible storytelling, for 15 years as well. And in this work, there's a strong shift from training expatriates to carry the load, but to train people like you see here in Vanuatu to do the work in their own language groups. People come with different worldviews, with different backgrounds, and we've found it to be a very rich experience. We've learned a lot. There have been a lot of skeptics. I can still remember bumping into people in where we started in Papua New Guinea. That was the first place we ran a project for Bible storytelling, and they being in the traditional written project and just saying that's not going to work, and then later people were saying, well, it could work there but not there, and then it worked there as well. So we've had a lot of skepticism during during the course of 15 years. So we started off in 2007 as well, attending an NBS conference when it was held in Georgia. And for us, that was a jaw-dropping experience. And we just want to say thanks very much for the things that we've learned through NBS. That was our house in Vanuatu. That was the view from our house, just to let you see what it looked like. But some of the things that we've learned from NBS, besides I remember listening to David Rhodes and to Dennis Dewey tell the same passage of Galatians and coming away thinking, those are very different takes from on the telling of Galatians. And that was after our jaws were still hanging down, just listening to somebody tell Galatians and thinking that it could be possible. So that many voices, well, those were two voices, but it showed how differently two different people can tell the same story. And then NBS also gave us passed on the idea of playing with the story or playing with parts in the story, which isn't too different from what we do in Bible translation. Although in storytelling, you could do it much quicker. It doesn't take as long to make a draft of a story or play with it in storytelling than it does in a written translation process. And the audience as part of the performance. I especially remember when during the one seminar, again, Galatians, the one professor from United Seminary, United Seminary, placed us in different parts of the room, 3 different parts. And his theory was that Paul was speaking to 3 different audiences. And then performance is not the end goal, but the participation. Well, you can read that. And then the rhetorical devices and oral features, sound mapping, and so on. So we are very much indebted to the things that we've learned through NBS, especially the Scholar Seminar. So I'll let Janet take it from here.
Okay, so along with the thanks to all of you, we feel like we've spent 15 years as interns with many of you folks learning, but we've also had the privilege of learning from other groups. These are mainly groups of people, small language group scattered around the globe, who have a very different lifestyle than the lifestyle that many of us have grown up with. And they have a lot to teach us about oral communication and community. And from some of these groups, we've learned the power of face-to-face telling, the power of story to make connections, to reach across differences or spectrums of society, and sharing stories, just how that can unify us. We've also learned about variation and identity. The ironic or an interesting thing was the very first workshop we decided or we were set to run in Papua New Guinea. They asked if we could work on stories of life of David, because following that workshop, they were going to go on and begin translating the life of David out of 1 Samuel. And so we agreed. And what we discovered is that they have traditional stories of the heroic young man who fights the giants and saves the community. And as soon as we asked for that particular genre of story to get the storytelling flowing, their language. It was a very friendly competition before launching into the David and Goliath story. What was exciting, there was a lot of pride in their own story, giant story. The young man who manages to kill the giant that's been terrorizing the community and becomes the hero. They automatically delighted in the fact that they each have their own variation and that we had time to listen to each other's. It was a very friendly competition, and there was no need to either try and harmonize them or to figure out which one was the best. Then we moved into the David and Goliath story, and it was it just set the tone for their whole Bible storytelling project, because the Bible too had a story like their stories. This became theirs. It was a way for them to enter into the Old Testament, not as something very, very foreign in somebody else's story, but we have a story to contribute. The Bible has this story to contribute, and it was a very, very serendipitous or God ordained beginning to our time with them. The other thing we learned is just how much wisdom is wrapped up in storytelling. A lot of the communities that we've had the opportunity to work with, wisdom comes in the form of a story, and it's often much more gentle and friendly. I think Eugene Peterson's the one who quotes Emily Dickinson to say it's tell it slant. In other words, tell it in story form, and people can often absorb the challenges or the exhortation to do something different, or the wisdom that they need to acquire. A lot of the people we work with, the older you are, the more stories you have, and the more experience you have in telling the stories at the right appropriate time, and that's very true. Ambiguity. Stories are live. We can only tell stories as we're living them right now. So this need to fix a story into one particular story that doesn't change, that there which is set in stone and is as it is and can't ever change, is not it's not a value. It's not it as a lot of these people showed us, that the stories are powerful because of the way they are alive and how they interact with us. And what we found more often than not, instead of people asking, is the story true, is more often than not, people want to know, is the story relevant to us? And that's part of this finding where the stories intersect with our lives. And if it's a good story, it's meant to be told and retold and shared and spread. The other thing that comes with the work that we're doing is that we get to explore these stories from groups of people who aren't majority groups. They're not the dominant culture. They're not the, if I may carefully say, they're not the dominant race or the dominant ethnic group. They're the minority group, and they interact with these stories in a very different way than my experience has been, and that's really eye-opening and powerful experience. Okay, Jim. And the result of that is we get to see these scriptures through a fresh interaction. So I've skated through that pretty fast, but you'll see pieces of that coming back when we start plowing into the examples. The process that we developed is it's different. It's different than what probably a lot of you experience, because we're working with language groups who aren't used to reading and writing their language. We're working with people who haven't had the layers upon layers of formal education, things like summarizing and putting titles to things. Scrutinizing words are not the way that they jump into stories. It's not the way they interact with language. And so the process that we have put together is full of storytelling, but it looks very different than, say, a linguistic approach, a theological approach, or even say an exegetical approach to studying the Bible. It's much more experiential, and it's around stories. So the first set of stories that we go through is everyone tells. So we have clusters of languages that meet together, anywhere from 2 language groups with 4 to 6, a team of 4 to 6 to 6, sometimes 8 language groups with teams of 4 to 6, all working together to do the storytelling. Okay, and so we start off with their own stories, and they could be stories of based on a certain theme, a certain genre, motif, archetype that is linked to the Bible stories that we're going to be working on. We kind of, there's a process we go through with those stories, sharing them, looking for particular words, looking for values, looking for where it's going to provide wonderful ways of talking about the biblical story once they get to it. But then the next step is that the facilitator, the person in charge of the training, tells the Bible story in the language of wider communication, the language, kind of their source language, from which they're going to learn the story and then tell it in their own language. And that part of the storytelling then leads to what we call an impact discussion. What did you like about the story? What jumped out for you about the story? What were your senses that were provoked? What other stories does it remind you of? As Sarah Agnew told us a couple of years ago in her keynote speech, we enter stories through our intuition, or we respond to stories through our intuition, the impact. And then our next step is sort of verify, or what we're experiencing, is that what the original author intended? So after that discussion, the story gets told again, usually by the facilitator trainer, maybe tell it 1 or 2 times. And then we go through the literary exegetical discussion, characters, plot, setting, most important thing, twists in the stories. And then, go ahead, Jim. The groups, in their groups, then take time to do what we call memory activity, image building activity, and that's performing the story in other arts, dramas, mimes, tableau, storyboards, with objects, moving objects around on a table, all sorts of different art forms. And then they begin practicing telling the story in groups, and we have kind of a robust peer review that they do. What did I forget? What did I add? What did I change? What's confusing about the way I told the story? Questions about the gestures and voice. And then we've also added another layer now of where have I as narrator inserted myself in the story. So in this small group practice, they're telling, retelling. Everyone's telling and retelling. We come back together, and that's when the facilitator then starts looking at the difficult portions and bringing in related stories. Other stories from other parts of the Bible. Does that help illuminate what's going on in this Bible story? Stories from dominant stories from the original audience of the Bible. And we let those stories rub up against each other and help illuminate the Bible story they're working on. They continue practicing the Bible story, shaping it, revising it, and telling it with what we call a fresh audience, going out and getting, telling to other people who will then respond to it, but then also telling it to a translation consultant who gives advice on revisions and fidelity to the whole Bible, the whole scripture. I raced through that. It's a full day just to do one Bible story. But I wanted you to see that the process that these folks go through. Today, we're going to talk about telling our own stories up against about a theme, a genre, a motif, an archetype, as it leads into this process and how those stories interact. Okay, OBS stands for Oral Bible Storytelling, not obstetrics or any of the other possibilities of those, but it's just too hard to write out oral Bible storytelling. And in our context, we need to say oral Bible storytelling because we're part of an organization that's all about writing. And so Bible storytelling means the written form. So we need to differentiate, and that's why our process has become OBS. Okay, so again, I've skated through. We could spend a whole, I don't know, on each one of these steps, but we're going to focus on the first. How do local stories from within the community, and the Bible stories interact? Go ahead, Jim. So what happens? I told you the story about the Jokani Kani, the giant story in Papua New Guinea. And in this case, what we found is that they had their giant stories. The young man that saves the village from the giant, and there's 8 different language groups represented here, and they were all busy telling each other their giant story, which then a lot of people kind of warned us that will then be a competition with the Bible story. People will mesh the two together. You'll end up with their stories becoming sacred like the Bible story, or all sorts of crazy notions. It didn't happen. These folks knew how to manage variations of stories. They knew it fit well within what they expect about stories, but the giant story and David and Goliath story is just like, oh yeah, this is for us. We do this. This is great. Okay. So that's an example of an archetype where we chose an archetype, a giant slayer, and match it to the Bible story. At times we use cultural themes, and it may be something like the story of widows. And we ask them to tell their stories of experiences being widows, or stories of how widows are treated in their community. And in particular, we were working in a part of the world, and because this is being recorded and the people that we work with are at times persecuted for being Christian, we're not going to use names or places or talk about languages. But in this part of South Asia, they had the history, the tradition of women being thrown on the funeral pyre when their husband died. And if you explore that with groups of people, there's this sense of the man's luck was tainted, or there's some connection between the man dying and his wife's bringing him bad luck. And so there's this acceptance or understanding of that. Now, that was outlawed in 1950, and by and large, it's no longer carried out. But instead, these women as widows are discarded. They're unlucky. They're not, the rest of the family don't want them around. They live in the margins of society. If they're young enough, their kids are taken away from them, especially if they're boys. And there's whole communities of widows living, as I said, in the margins of society. So we were asking for these kinds of stories. And as we were tackling the story of Ruth, the women working together, it was a project for women. And we were anticipating that the story of Ruth would be an encouraging story for them. Because here are these widows, and it turns right in the end, right? Here are these widows that aren't ostracized or thrown out, but they're pulled back into their community, and things work out. Well, we didn't get very far into Ruth, and the whole story was very distasteful. They could not imagine a widow talking even hypothetically about possibly getting married again. And if you recall in the beginning of Ruth, Naomi says, even if I could get married today and got pregnant right away, you wouldn't wait around 20 years for my son to grow up and marry him. No, it's just go back to your family. That was so distasteful, this sort of notion that a widow would even think to say that, that we ran into this huge cultural mismatch, and took us quite a while and most of the book of Ruth to be able to work our way through that. But what we did find, to our surprise, is that the relationship between Naomi and Ruth, both widows, was just so encouraging and delightful that they could get along and they could find ways to work with each other and help each other. Was just a revolutionary thought for these people, because in that society, the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law has been described to us as toxic. It's the mother-in-law's job to treat their daughter-in-law as slaves, and keep them in line, and full well knowing that daughter-in-law will one day be the mother-in-law if she has any sons, and her time will come to be in that position. And all of a sudden they were faced with this relationship, and literally husbands were coming to Jim and saying, we love this project. We have never had such peace in our household as when these women started learning to tell the story of Ruth. Again, what we anticipated, what we planned in terms of picking their stories and putting them together with the Bible stories wasn't what I imagined. It was the whole thing kind of went sideways, but it landed where it was supposed to be. And Ruth became their favorite story, and a wonderful story. Took us a long time to go back and rework that beginning. But we were able to come to the end, and they loved telling the story of Ruth. Okay, so that's cultural themes. We don't always choose the right one, guess the right one, but somehow it always seems to land in the right place. Another archetype that we have used in the past is the whole holy man. What is the lifestyle and the character of a holy man? Thinking in terms of illuminating the life of Jesus and what's going on in Jesus' life. So when we did this kind of putting these stories together, in East Africa, the holy man of East Africa and the life of Jesus didn't fit. They weren't the same. A holy man in the life of an East African is someone who sits at home and others come to him. And his whole status as a holy man is that he gets to stay still and people come and bring him all sorts of gifts, and he amasses a certain wealth and a lifestyle of comfort and ease. Well, that's quite contrary to Jesus as holy man. Does it diminish Jesus as holy man for them? No, but they need to be aware that the model that Jesus was showing as a holy man isn't the model that they have come to expect for a holy man. And in other parts of the world that we've worked, that peripatetic kind of journeying holy man does work. In South Asia, that's what holy men do. They live lives of poverty, and they move around from place to place, sharing their wisdom. So we never know where these archetypes are going to take us. But an interesting thing is that in this picture, as we were telling stories, rabbi stories from Jesus' time, we discovered that Jesus was pretty unique in his presentation of holy man compared to the rabbis' lifestyle of the rabbis, who were much more stationary. People came to them applying to be their disciples. People came to them to learn wisdom from them. So Jesus was acting out of the ordinary, or not typical as a holy man might be expected to live in that time. Other themes that we have used are the marriage theme with folks in Papua New Guinea. We asked them to tell us the story of how they were betrothed, and it was their marriages were arranged, and they talked about how marriages are arranged between families. They build bridges between families, and in the culture in which the dominant interaction is payback. So payback meaning for the good and for the bad, and well beyond an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If you do anything to harm anybody in across the clans, it's their duty to pay back, but in excess of what was done to them. And so these marriages are seen as bridges, that they're like a peace pact. But when a young man and a young woman take matters in their own hands, and as they say, jump through the window, then it upsets the whole clan system, and that couple will end up being married, but it comes with a lot of burden. if the family arranges the marriage. If the family doesn't arrange the marriage, then literally people are killed to pay back a young man having stolen a young woman. So we got to the Jesus birth story after they had shared all these stories, and Joseph rose to in their esteem. A lot of these people were churched. They went to church. They knew the Christmas story, but hadn't really paid attention to it. And we of course invite them to dig deeply into it. And they realized, as a group, and another group in South Asia said, Jesus is kind of like a match, or Joseph's kind of like a matchstick. You sort of light him and use them once, and then he throw it away. Joseph, on the other hand, became quite an amazing character because he didn't have Mary killed, or he didn't seek retribution from her family for her infidelity. Mary, on the other hand, in her experience, becomes a superhero for agreeing to do this, knowing full well that she could be killed. And it's like there's like full understanding now why Mary ends up having her baby without all her aunties and her sisters around her to help her deliver her baby, because they're shunned, they're shamed, they're hiding this pregnancy. And then once again, it's no surprise that they end up refugees in Egypt without the protection of the family clan, because nobody really wants to claim them because of all the scandal and the shame. In all of this, we were working with some Protestant groups, some Catholic groups, and I remember distinctly one of the young Catholic men saying at the end of having gone through the stories of Luke, stories of Matthew, birth narratives, and this young man from the Catholic Church saying, now, remind us again, what is it that you Protestants have against Mary? And nobody being able to respond with anything reasonable after having had that experience. So that's another example of just very general themes that we put together. Much more focused are stories about sacrifice. Another group that we did the stories of Abraham with, of course, we had to come up with what are the words going to be that they use for sacrifice, offering, gift, costly gift, bribe, incentive payments. What is it, that word that describes what God asked Abraham to do with his son Isaac? Now, we didn't know this, didn't know what we were getting into, but one of the groups, the Are group teams in the workshop they came ready to tell their stories of sacrifices. We were looking at the semantic domain, trying to figure out all the possible words and which ones fit for this story. And when the Are team came to share their story, we discovered that up until the 1950s, they practiced infant sacrifice. They burned infants. And they did this as a way of ending disasters, natural disasters, droughts, floods, cyclones, diseases, waves, pandemics, earthquakes, whatever disaster was plaguing them, as a way of appeasing the spirits that were causing this disaster. They would sacrifice a child, burn a child, and everyone knew when they saw from a certain direction black smoke rising, they knew what was going on. This practice stopped in the 1950s when an Australian patrolman, that was late 50s, when Australia was government oversight in Papua New Guinea. And this Australian patrolman, they called him Keops, discovered what was happening. Now, to this day, I should say, this part of Papua New Guinea cannot be reached by a road, by a plane, by a helicopter. The only way you can reach this part of Papua New Guinea is to walk, and to walk a long way, or by boat around the coast and coming the coast. So this, not surprising that these things were slow to be revealed, say, to the wider world, but this Australian officer was shocked, and that practice was outlawed, and they weren't allowed to do it anymore. What was interesting to us is that Christianity had reached this part of Papua New Guinea maybe as early as the 1900s, 1910s, through Samoan missionaries. So the church was surviving side by side with this practice. They stopped the practice, but the one man who, from the Are group named Dixon, this became the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, became his signature story. You know, a lot of us end up with these signature stories that really, at least at a particular time in your life, you hang on to that story. This became his signature story. So we asked him, what delights you about this story? Why is this your signature story? And he shared, he kept saying, God's provision. God's provision. This is a God of the people. Exploring it further, it became clear to him, he understood in the Abraham story that God provided this sacrifice. It was God going kind of the extra mile, God going above and beyond to show his faithfulness to his promise, his willingness to engage with Abraham, giving the animal for the sacrifice. So in his culture that had this age-old tradition that required a child sacrifice to end a disaster, he had a reason for it now. Where it was outlawed before, he saw the beauty of a God that got involved with the people instead of staying remote and demanding this sacrifice. It reminded me of something that Jim has talked about with Elie Wiesel and his writings. I've heard from others, is this notion of a back and forth testing, Abram testing God, that he will be present and faithful as much as God testing Abram, will he be obedient to what he's asked? And for Dixon, that was a God that he could wholesale follow and accept. So what turned out to be kind of a grim beginning to this, entering into this story, ended up to be, once again, a beautiful outcome. We landed in the right place. Okay. A few more examples, and then we'll open it up with some questions. But Moses' birth story. Phil was with us when we did this story in Jamaica. And I must admit, Moses' birth story, if I picked a character that I focused on, admired, thought about, it was Pharaoh's daughter, that she was willing to stand up to her father, that she was willing to accept this Hebrew child, rescue this Hebrew child, defy a gruesome, awful edict of killing of children. And I never really thought much about why it was that I entered the story in that place. Later, I discovered that this group of Jamaicans, and it happens to be all women in this picture, but it was a mixed group, entered the story through the life of the Israelites, the Hebrews. And for them, the empathy, the place of entering the story was through the slaves that had been oppressed. And if you haven't heard Anna Kay's version of this story, it's just absolutely beautiful. Just the privilege that we have to be able to see these stories from so many different angles and so many perspectives that allows for just all facets of the gem of this story to shine. It's an amazing privilege. Okay, creation stories. We end up doing a lot with creation stories. Lots of areas have creation stories. In Southwest Ethiopia, the creation stories that they have are all about women provoking the gods and the gods withdrawing. One woman wants God to send the rain. She takes a fire stick and pokes a god in the eye, and he moves away, and they don't have rain again for years. These are the kinds of stories that they tell about creation and why the world is the way it is for them. We also discovered in Ethiopia that they had revised the Genesis 2 story. And in their revision of the Genesis 2 story, God puts the man to sleep, removes the bone from his side, and he gives it to Angel Gabriel to hold on to. I guess because he needed two hands to sew up the man's side. I don't know. Gabriel is holding the bone from the side of the man, and Satan snatches it and runs, and Gabriel gave chase. But before Gabriel could get to Satan and get the bone back, Satan dove into a hole, and all Gabriel could get was the tail. And so Gabriel returned to God, gave God the tail of the devil, and women were created from the tail of the devil. This, to me, was just like the most sobering and depressing workshop that we started. All these stories about women and the reason women are put in their place. One of the groups has an initiation rite that is rite of passage for the young men. They have to beat their mothers and their grandmothers with sticks till they're bloody. It just like sucked all the air out of the room as they were sharing these stories. And I remember the man who was telling the creation story as the facilitator and telling it as it is in Genesis 2. And he stopped before the end and he looked at all the people around him and he said, "We need a better way to talk about women." And it was all I could do not to jump up and just throw my arms around the guy and just hug him and bless him. Wouldn't have been appropriate, didn't work, but that's the miracle, the power of the creation stories that we have in the Bible. And it reminded me very much of Richard Swanson's keynote address and talking about the Israelite grandmothers in Babylon as their grandkids were hearing their creation story, making sure that they heard the Genesis creation stories, and just letting them speak to each other and not needing to defend the creation story. Okay, so more about the creation stories. Stories I've mentioned, have power. In the Pacific, land ownership is defined by who can tell the ancient stories about the land. Deeds, courts of law mean far less than who knows the stories about the land. When you start doing the Genesis stories, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's all about land. This was God speaking right to them. The man made from the soil, the animals made from the soil of the land, that tie between our identity and our land. In Vanuatu, where we lived, you could buy the use of the land for a certain period of time, but you could not transfer ownership. There's just no possible way. This is this people group land, and you could have lease it for 100 years. It still belongs to the rightful owners of the land. And so as we were doing the stories of Genesis 2 and the beauty of the tie of the land and the people and the land and their identity, they totally got it. We encouraged them to think about possibly simplifying in their telling all the names of the rivers, because they mean little to them, nothing doing. They had to have every single detail in there because this is about the land and our identity. So we learned all of the names of the rivers, and it taught us a lesson to not presume and not make recommendations too hastily. When they got to the end of Genesis 3, and there couldn't have been a much more poignant punishment of being separated from the land, being cursed to the land, having to toil to grow food and weeds. They absolutely got it. The just punishment. Abusing the fruit of the land, the punishment from the land. They totally identified with that story, which goes on with the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain then being destined to wander. And the groups that we worked with had all sorts of metaphors for being destined to wander. They just highlighted that portion because for them it was the most painful thought of being banished from the land, banished from your people, separated from God. We heard metaphors of like driftwood caught in the tide. They have a particular songbird that never lands. They never find the nest of the songbird. They became like these songbirds, never able to land anywhere and rest. Their appreciation for that theme of the land and the identity of land speaks to them immensely. So we talked a lot about this cursing from the land and the payback, and asked them to talk about the most important thing from the Cain and Abel story. With tears in their eyes, they said, this is a gracious God. And we were like, wait a minute, we're talking about curse from the land. We're talking about wandering and banished. And tell us more. Where do you see the mercy of God in this? They kept delighting in the mercy of God in this story. And they said, payback. God should have wiped out Cain and worse. But when Cain didn't have a clan to keep him safe from anybody else who was going to take advantage of him, God was his clan. God stepped in, marked him, and said, I will protect you. For them, that was just breathtaking. I would never have seen that. I would never have thought of it from that perspective. But it was just a beautiful reminder of this immense, awesome, amazing God, and the power of his stories to transform our thinking, our way of life. This same group live in the Pacific Rim of Fire. These groups of people, they know volcanoes. They live with volcanoes. Volcanoes are, it would be far too simple to say that volcanoes are gods. That's not it. And it would be far too simple to say that the volcano is where the gods live. But volcanoes are kind of like the vehicle of communication. When the volcano rumbles and spews and earthquakes happen, God's doing something. And it may be, in the end, it may be good. You know, if you have volcanic ash that falls on your garden of watermelons, your watermelons are going to be really sweet that year. If the ash falls on your leafy greens, forget it, they're done. They're burned, but you'll have sweet watermelons. So it's terrifying, it's awesome, but the God could be using the volcano to their benefit or to their detriment. And they don't know. The God's capricious. They have no idea. But when the volcanoes rumble, they know. They live there. It's terrifying. It's awesome. Spews rocks the size of apartment buildings, rain down on him. I spent a week in a village that all night we shook like this as these boulders went rumbling down the volcano cone just nearby, and I kept waiting for one of them to land on me. And that's their life. So when we got to the story of Moses going up Mount Sinai and the people at the bottom of this volcano, they were captivated. This is how God catches our attention. This is God. This is what gods do. This is it. But what totally amazed them is that Moses came down with laws, with rules, with standards of living, with a covenant relationship. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. You'll have no other gods but me. That whole thing, transaction, was just way out of any of their expectation of what their capricious understanding of these gods who speak through the volcanoes. And they had a beautiful response to this story. Oh, Jim's telling me it's time. Where did we go with that volcano story? From not long after that, we started doing the stories of David, and we did a story for to set up the whole transition from kings, or from judges to kings. The story out of Samuel. Oh, forgive me for my numbers. I'm looking at my notes. I had my eyes. Oh, Samuel 8, 1 Samuel 8. Had my eyes dilated so a hard time reading my notes. But in Samuel 8, the people come to Samuel and say, your sons are not acting like you are. They're verse 3. they're not like their father. They're greedy for money, they accept bribes, and they pervert justice. And this group had no words for bribes and perverting justice. A person in charge, his word is law. He gets to do whatever he wants to do. They had no way of saying that. If they knew about being greedy for money, but you know, if you're a big man, if you're in that position, that's your right. You do that, right? But perverting for justice, bribes, how can it be? A big man says he wants to do it, and that's it. That's kind of like the law under this leader. And so we had to kind of deal with this, and it was just a revolutionary thought that God had standards for the way leaders were to act, and realizing that these standards were to keep the leaders from abusing the people. Well, what was going to happen just months after that was a national election in Papua New Guinea. And I'm sure Carol could tell us stories too, but national elections in that part of the world can end up in a lot of violence and fighting as everybody's working to get their big man in position and have access to money and power, because then that means they'll get some of the trickle down. And so we were kind of fearful when they said, now we know. We thought we could never get rid of these leaders. They're in place, they're there, and that, you know, whatever. And we were sort of frightened, like, were they going to then feel empowered to rise up against their leaders or something? And we asked, well, what do you plan to do? And the response was, well, of course, we're going to pray. And it was just exactly what Samuel had done. He went to God and prayed and talked to God about it. That kind of role modeling, again, it was beautiful, opened up a whole new way of thinking for this group of people who have lived with this thought that a leader can do whatever his, that's why they're in that position. They can do whatever they want. Okay. Just some of examples. You know, there's so many more that we could tell you. Gosh, I didn't even touch on the daughters of Zelophehad. There's one more I want to share with you, and this happened last year, and it just, again, these are gems. They fall in our lap and they bless us, and our lives are so much richer by it. And I hope you're enjoying it. We asked a group, we're working a group in South Asia, and we asked them to come ready to tell their own parables, teaching stories, stories that you tell that have that nugget in it that provoke us to think more deeply, think more, are caught up and surprised that one expectation and the twist kind of hits you and makes you think more. However you want to describe parables. Well, this group came back, and all of the parables that they shared, our reason for asking them was to look at the form. How are they going to tell parables? How do you open? How do you speak about people in parables? And so they could match the form, and people would recognize when they're telling the Good Samaritan, they'd recognize, oh, this is a parable. They didn't have any. They came back, and all the parables that they were telling us have been borrowed from another country and translated in their language. And we were like, well, okay, so how do people in the majority language, majority religion, tell stories? Do they have teaching stories? Don't they have ways of teaching their community? And their immediate answer was no, they don't teach. And it took us off. And this is what Doug Lippman talks about, stories running amok. They began telling us their horrific stories of their persecution they face at the hand of the people of the majority religion, at the government who favors the majority religion, and it's tied to their identity. And so these folks who have chosen to become Christian get burned out of their homes, they get beaten, all sorts of horrific stories came out. We then did the story, parable of the Good Samaritan. And for them, the Good Samaritan's an absolute fool. There's like nothing worthwhile about going out and helping someone. If you go out and help somebody that's not your family, they're going to take advantage of you. They're going to treat you like a fool. You'll find no end to the need that they will come back and continue to demand from you. And so this parable just was not compelling and not convincing. And when they went home to test it with people, everybody told them the same thing that was their instinct. The Samaritan's a fool. Okay, so we let that sit for a while. They continued to tell it. They continued to sort of wrestle with it among themselves. Went on to the next set of stories in another workshop, and they were working on the story from Mark 10 of a place of honor. It's where James and John, Jesus predicts his death and how his death is going to play out when they get up to Jerusalem. James and John ask for a position of honor on his right and his left, and Jesus launches into, can you drink from the cup of suffering that I'm going to drink from? And can you be baptized in the baptism of suffering that I'll be baptized in? And then he says, yes, you will. And then there's this horror among the other disciples when they find out what James and John did. And Jesus says to him, the picture paints the picture of the servant leader. Those the one who wants to lead must serve others. And the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to give his life as a ransom for many. And then it clicked. Then they understood what the parable of the Good Samaritan was meant to tell them. That it's the model of servant leadership that doesn't continue the cycle of violence, that stops it in its tracks. And in that moment, I realized that all of our tug of war of trying not to paint God as a God like Zeus firing down punishment and bolts of lightning, who's not punitive in his responses to people's sins, but anticipates them well ahead of time and teaches lots about forgiveness and mercy as much as he teaches us a code of living. Stop the cycle of violence in his willingness to die on a cross. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but with Dr. Rene Girard and his description of the act of Jesus on the cross being this end to violence, this end to scapegoating that we tend to fall into. But his willingness to say, do what you want. I'm not responding in violence. Totally made sense to this group. And then they were willing to say, no, the Good Samaritan's not the fool. and they could see the reason for why Jesus would encourage them to do that, knowing full well that they're going to be taken advantage of, they're going to be treated like a fool. But the greater purpose is the end to violence. Okay. I will stop the list there, open it up to, let me just give it to Phil to floor questions or comments. Again, this is kind of a thin slice of what we do, but a lot of it is stories running into stories and the things, the power that we're able to discover. So comments, questions.
If you, so I think we're going to give the seminary members priority, just so that you can hear a conversation among us. But if that goes dry, then we'll expand it out. If you're a scholar and you want to respond, if you raise your hand, that helps Zoom put you in a queue. And so we'll open it up for responses, but I'll just say thank you so much. You two are the only ones in the group that could supply us these stories. And so it's been fascinating listening to you. I'm like, okay, who's going to email the board and say, well, we think we found some more keynote speakers for future years. And so, but I'll open it up to the group, the seminar. We're just in awe. So we're just
No, or it's been a long. Go ahead, Pam. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. I actually put in the chat, quoting what you'd said earlier, your phrase about letting all the facets of the gem of the story shine. I really love that. And you've through the sharing, excuse me, of your stories and experiences here, you've really painted a very vibrant picture of that for us. And it's really inspiring. Thank you for all of that and for that phrase in particular. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And Jim, as Jim started, this is maybe our giving back a bit to you all who have, I hope you see your fingerprints in a lot of this, because you all set us off in the right direction and shaped this and have helped us grow it. Go ahead, Richard.
Just wanted to mostly thank you. This is really lovely to think about, but I wanted to thank you for one thing in particular. I wanted to thank you for something that's been true in every conversation we've had through these years. I come away deeply impressed with your ability to see and hear, and to actually see. Seeing can be a violent act, but in your case, it is a hospitable act, and that has impressed me through all the years. And the place that I heard that particularly in what you were talking about this evening was the recognition of the difficulty in telling Jesus stories as holy man stories, or Jesus as rabbi stories. It is one of the real benefits of knowing someone like you two, with your awareness of rich difference, that it may in fact be the case that the gospel stories that we suppose we know are in fact also in our culture not holy man stories and not rabbi stories. We may not know what they are. And it takes someone listening from across lines of rich difference, and it takes someone with good eyes and ears like the two of you to make it clear that we might simply have misunderstood our own stories. And as someone who's been fascinated by these stories, the greatest gift is anytime I discover that I've misunderstood. So thank you, because I've got something I got to chew on for a long time, and it's a gift that you've given us many times.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you. I often feel like we set off in ignorance, and in the process, things are illuminated. Yeah, because we just don't know. We don't know where these stories are going to go or what they're going to inspire. But I can honestly say we've never been shamed. No, I can tell you a few examples of one place where they were disgusted with God that would allow a unwed teenage girl to be pregnant. And we decided to leave that go for a while. The group didn't have to deal with that one right off the bat, but
Mhm.
but yeah, there are places where it does offend. But yeah, but for the most part, we find out it ends up far better than anything we could possibly have organized. So go ahead, Tracy.
This may have been answered in so many words, maybe even with Richard naming your ability to see and hear so well. But I'm wondering, I mean, most of us probably aren't going to have the opportunity to go to really, really, really foreign to us cultures. And yet there's a lot of like foreign cultures as far as people thinking and understanding and interpreting, God and religion and Christianity very differently from maybe the way that we do. And I'm just wondering if you have any words of wisdom for how to graciously go into those situations to invite the dialogue, especially considering how divisive, things seem to be. We're just, it's very difficult to have any kind of conversation once we kind of, get a whiff that, oh, they might be, one of those people, right? So in all of your years of experience, do you have any sort of very practical words of wisdom?
Start with their stories. And that, again, is something we kind of fell into with a linguistic or a semantic. We were trying to help them find the right words, and we were thinking they were going to, analyze the forms that their stories took so that they could then use that form or those words in the Bible stories. But no, what it did was it created this sense of we all have stories to tell, and we all have the only way we can come to the Bible story is through our stories. And that's, I mean, Walter Rongren talks about that, and others. That's not some sort of wisdom for my part, but all of a sudden we see it happening. The only way any of us interact with the Bible story is through our story, and allowing them to express their stories, and then freely let their stories and the Bible stories go where they're going to take them, without us feeling like we have to corral it or send it in the right direction. It's been amazing. For me, it's been, it's absolutely changed my faith, in the sense of, wow, this thing is far more powerful than I ever could imagine. So I think that being able to start with our own stories and then the Bible story, but also not being afraid to add a bit more to help people verify that what they intuit about the Bible story may actually be more about their story than the Bible story. And so adding stories to help reach a place where it makes sense. But yeah, that it's that in my humble opinion, that's what served us well. But we did it that way for one reason. Turned out it was something entirely different that we discovered.
Janet, and Jim, I'm wondering if it's hard when you have a powerful experience like that and then go to another context to start fresh with the same story, or if it's like that experience was so profound, instead of bringing the one you grew up with and wanting to impose it in a context, you have this new thing that you're like, you want to share. Or I wonder if that's that. I could see where that might be a challenge for me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we had a great, profound experience of discovering this kind of universal God that can reach beyond geographic boundaries, national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, language boundaries. And when we were doing the story of Elijah and the widow, and just the fact that you've got this Israelite king with his other wife, he married outside of the clan, for that group that was like, that's trouble to begin with. And this God bringing about drought and whatever, and the way God rescues Elijah is to send him to Jezebel's country, and there's this blessing of not just the oil in her jar and the flour that never ends, and they survive, but then the boy dies, and God has mercy and raises the boy. And it was just this tremendous experience in Papua Guinea, where their spirits are tied to a location, and there are spirits, and people would tell us, oh, you don't have to worry about it. You're not from here. They're not going to bother you. We have to worry about it because, these are our spirits. And, just this whole sort of bounded spirit realm. And here they're discovering this God that orchestrates cross borders and cross languages, and they really loved it. So then we went from there, and I did the same story with groups that work in I'll just say it, Middle East. Okay. And I'm thinking one thing about this story, and they just really scrambled with that story of God sending a man alone, and the man and the woman interaction, this widow, obviously a young widow with a boy. It really kind of disturbed them. And for them, it was much more of a disturbing story than this sort of, as you said, Phil, we had just come off a high, and it was just such an aha. And I'm thinking, oh, they're going to identify with this story because crossing that boundary where there's so much strife, and didn't work. It was like, it was total different experience with them. And for them, it was far more the issue around famine and water and provision and that place of God in that worldview. I'm not sure. We didn't spend a whole lot of time there. We only had a day with that group, so we didn't get to really follow it up. But yeah, sometimes you think, oh, this is going to be a winner, and you just realize, oh well, that didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. So yeah, it's always, yeah, you always have to be on your toes.